Join me as I dive into this courtroom drama and try to figure out how a judge's shocking outburst could leave the victim completely speechless. They told her she would never be believed. They told her the system was not built for people like her. And on the morning she walked into that cold courtroom, every stare, every whisper, every mocking smile from the defense reminded her of one truth. She was the underdog, fighting against a man who had money, power, and friends in high places. But what no one saw coming was the way the story would twist in the end. And when justice finally roared through that courtroom, the judge himself, the same man who mocked her, was left speechless and shaking as the verdict echoed louder than his gavel ever could. Her name was Maya Jackson, a young black woman from a small working-class neighborhood. She had grown up being taught to respect the law, to believe that justice had no color, no price tag. But all of that would be tested when she became the victim of a violent attack at the hands of a man the whole town treated like royalty. Richard Halston, son of a wealthy businessman, a man who wore arrogance like a crown and thought money could erase any sin, he cornered her one night when she was just walking home from her late shift, and what happened left scars deeper than the ones on her skin. Maya gathered courage and reported the crime. But from the moment the case entered the courthouse, it became clear this was not going to be fair. The judge, Judge Clarence Monroe, was an old man with decades on the bench, known for being tough on crime, but only when defendants were poor. When the rich stood before him, his toughness turned into excuses. As the trial began, Maya sat in that witness chair, heart pounding, telling the truth with every word. But instead of compassion, instead of respect, she was met with something she never imagined in a courtroom: laughter, mockery, from the very man who was supposed to protect her rights. Judge Monroe leaned over his bench, smirking, and said, "Miss Jackson, are we really supposed to believe a man like Mr. Halston would risk everything for someone like you?" The courtroom chuckled, and Maya felt her world collapse. Her attorney objected, furious, but the judge brushed it off with a wave of his hand, as if her pain was just a performance. Maya clenched her fists, swallowing tears, and in that moment, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life. But what the judge didn't know, what the defense didn't count on, was that the jury was watching. They saw Maya's trembling hands, her raw honesty, the way she held on despite every insult, and deep down, seeds of doubt began to grow, seeds that would soon bloom into something no amount of money or power could uproot. The defense paraded witness after witness, painting Halston as a good man from a good family. They called Maya confused, attention-seeking, even delusional. And every time Maya tried to hold her head high, Judge Monroe's smirk returned, as if he already knew how the story would end. But destiny has a way of turning tables when arrogance blinds the powerful. Halfway through the trial, a piece of evidence emerged that no one expected: a torn sleeve from Halston's expensive tailored shirt. Found near the alley where Maya was attacked, the defense tried to dismiss it as irrelevant, but the forensic expert testified that the DNA matched Halston's, and the jury leaned forward, their eyes sharper now, their expressions harder to sway. Still, the judge rolled his eyes, saying, "Coincidences happen every day, ladies and gentlemen." But for the first time, the jury didn't laugh with him. They shifted, uncomfortable, as if realizing the road didn't make him righteous. Day after day, Maya endured insults. When she broke down crying on the stand, the judge mocked her tears, saying, "Compose yourself, this isn't theater." When her mother tried to sit by her side for comfort, he ordered her out of the courtroom. Maya felt abandoned, humiliated, stripped of her dignity by the very system that promised justice. And yet, she did not give up. Her lawyer whispered to her one night, "Hold on, Maya, just hold on. Juries don't always listen to judges. Sometimes they listen to truth." And those words carried her through the storm. Finally, the day of closing arguments arrived. The defense painted Halston as a victim of a vindictive young woman out to ruin his reputation. The judge nodded along, tapping his gavel like a man waiting for the play to end. But then Maya's attorney rose, his voice trembling with passion. He spoke not just of evidence, but of humanity. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you believe that justice is only for the powerful, then you will let this man walk free. But if you believe that truth still matters, if you believe that every person, no matter how rich or poor, has the right to dignity, then you will stand with Maya Jackson." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge's smirk faded for a moment. The jury left to deliberate. Hours passed. The judge joked with the defense. confident in his outcome. Maya sat praying, hands shaking, wondering if this was all for nothing. And then the door opened, the jury returned, and the foreman's voice cut through the heavy silence. On the charge of assault and battery, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps filled the room. Halston's face went pale, his father's mouth hung open, and Judge Monroe, the man who mocked, belittled, and sneered, suddenly shifted in his chair, his gavel frozen midair. But the foreman wasn't done. On the charge of aggravated assault with intent, guilty. The word struck like thunder. Maya's tears fell, but this time they were not tears of shame. They were tears of vindication. And then it happened, the moment no one saw coming. As the courtroom erupted, the judge slammed his gavel, his hands trembling, his voice cracking as he struggled to regain control. But the jury was done listening to him. They had spoken, and for the first time in decades, Judge Clarence Monroe, the man who believed he could shape justice with sarcasm and favoritism, was silenced by the power of truth. The irony was bitter, poetic, and undeniable. He had mocked the victim, only to watch her rise as a symbol of justice in front of his eyes. But the story doesn't end here, because what happened next would shake the entire courthouse, expose secrets that had been buried for years, and turn this single verdict into the spark of something much bigger. Because Judge Monroe had secrets of his own, and when those secrets came to light, it wouldn't just be the defendant's life crumbling in front of him, it would be his own. They thought the storm ended when the jury delivered its shocking verdict, but the real storm had only just begun. Judge Monroe, once smug and untouchable, walked out of the courtroom that day with his robe draped over his arm, his head lowered in a way the public had never seen before. The man who mocked a victim in open court had suddenly become the victim of whispers, suspicion, and shadows that followed him everywhere. The newspaper spun the story as justice served. Jury defies judge, one headline read. But in the quiet corners of the courthouse, there were murmurs, dark murmurs. Clerks who worked under Monroe for years exchanged glances they dared not explain. Attorneys who once bowed to him now avoided eye contact. And behind those stone-cold courthouse walls, secrets that Monroe had buried for decades were clawing their way to the surface. It began with a single voice. A former victim who had sat in Monroe's courtroom years earlier, trembling, broken, waiting for compassion, only to be ridiculed by the very man who swore to uphold justice. That victim, now grown, stepped forward, speaking to a local reporter. She described not just Monroe's mockery, but the strange pattern in his rulings. The powerful protected, the vulnerable dismissed, cases swept under the rug if the defendant had money or influence. The story caught fire. What was supposed to be a tale of a jury defying arrogance turned into something more dangerous, an expose on Judge Monroe himself. And then came the documents. An anonymous envelope slid across a reporter's desk. Inside, sealed transcripts, confidential memos, and records no one outside Monroe's chambers should ever have seen. They showed cases dismissed without explanation, evidence lost under suspicious circumstances, and rulings that bent the law in favor of the elite. One case, in particular, stood out, a case involving a wealthy businessman accused of crimes too dark to repeat. The victim? Silence. The evidence? Suppressed. And the judge who signed off on it all? Monroe. The walls began to close in. But Monroe wasn't the type to surrender. Oh no. He still held the gavel of intimidation. He lashed out in interviews, calling the accusation witch hunts and fabricated lies. He insisted the jury's verdict in the last trial was an anomaly, nothing more. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something unsettled, because Monroe had a secret no verdict could erase. Late one evening, a young law clerk stumbled upon something hidden deep inside the courthouse archives. A locked file misplaced among routine paperwork. It bore Monroe's signature, but didn't belong to any official record. Inside that file was the one thing Judge Monroe feared more than exposure. A name, a connection, a thread that linked him directly to the crimes he had covered. And just as the clerk's trembling fingers traced the signature, a shadow fell over the doorway. Footsteps echoed. Slow, heavy, deliberate, looking for something. The voice wasn't friendly. It wasn't curious. It was Monroe's. The clerk froze, caught between truth and terror. Monroe smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Careful," he whispered. "Some doors in this courthouse are meant to stay closed." And in that chilling moment, the clerk realized this wasn't just about corruption. This was about survival. Judge Monroe wasn't just mocking victims. He was hiding something monstrous, something that could destroy more than his career. The world thought they had seen justice served. But in truth, the real trial hadn't even begun. Because the next chapter in Monroe's story would reveal not just his corruption, but the dark alliances he'd built to protect it. Alliances that stretched far beyond the courtroom. Alliances that would do anything, to keep their secrets buried. And as Monroe turned off the light and left the clerk trembling in the dark, one thing became painfully clear. This was only the beginning. The whispers around Judge Monroe had grown into a roar. What began as murmurs of arrogance and corruption now carried the weight of names, powerful names. People who moved in the shadows, cloaked in wealth and influence, men who shook hands in public while burying skeletons in private. The clerk who found the locked file didn't sleep that night. His trembling hands copied every page, hiding the duplicates where Monroe's reach couldn't find them. And as dawn broke, he stared at the names scrawled across the documents. Businessmen, politicians, even law enforcement officers, all tied together by one common thread. Judge Monroe. But the real bombshell? Monroe wasn't serving the law. He was serving an alliance. The alliance, as the clerk would soon call it, was an invisible chain of men who controlled verdicts, silenced victims, and crushed anyone who dared resist. Monroe wasn't the king of this empire. He was merely the gavel that legitimized their crimes. The man in the robe had always been a puppet, and behind him were the puppeteers who never wanted their faces exposed. Meanwhile, the press circled like hawks. Reporters sniffed at the edges of the story, not realizing they were tugging at threads that could unravel the entire justice system. And for the first time, Monroe began to lose control. His arrogance slipped, his temper boiled. In one closed hearing, he slammed the gavel so hard it cracked, his voice shaking as he barked at attorneys who dared mention the growing scandal. But outside the courthouse walls, something bigger was building. One of Monroe's closest allies, a senator whose name carried weight in every corner of the state, started to sweat. He knew if Monroe fell, he would fall with him. And in a desperate bid to protect himself, he whispered to an investigative journalist. The information he leaked was enough to set the city on fire. Secret meetings in hotel rooms, unexplained payments in offshore accounts, victims coerced into silence with threats that went far beyond courtroom. The alliance wasn't just real, it was untouchable. Or so they thought. The jury that once defied Monroe became heroes in the public's eye, their verdict now seen as the first crack in the alliance's fortress. And as more victims came forward, courage rippling from one voice to another, the fortress began to shake. But Monroe wasn't finished. One stormy night, he sat alone in his study, the glow of a single lamp burning over stacks of papers. He poured himself a drink with a trembling hand, muttering under his breath, "If I go down, I'm not going down alone." And with that, Monroe made his move. He reached out to the alliance, not to beg for protection, but to threaten them. He held secrets too. He knew names they couldn't afford to see in headlines. And if they thought they could sacrifice him, he would drag them into the pit with him. But power built on blackmail is a fragile throne. Because somewhere, in a dimly lit room, a camera was rolling. A journalist had gotten closer than anyone realized. Monroe's threats, his confessions, his unraveling, all of it was captured. Proof, undeniable proof, that the judge was not only corrupt but tied to a web that stretched beyond the law. And just when the journalist prepared to release the footage to the world, the screen went black. The recording cut off mid-sentence. The file vanished. The alliance had moved first. The journalist disappeared. The clerk, who discovered the documents, was followed home. And Monroe, he showed up to court the next morning with a strange calm in his eyes, as if he knew something no one else did. The people thought the alliance was about to collapse. But in truth, the game had only just changed. Because now, Monroe wasn't fighting for his career. He was fighting for survival. And in that fight, he was willing to burn the entire system to the ground. The courthouse was silent that morning, but the silence wasn't peace, it was fear. Every whisper in the hallways carried one name, Judge Monroe. By now, the Alliance had tightened its grip. Journalists had vanished. Files had burned. Victims had been silenced. And yet, something strange lingered in the air, an uneasy Alliance couldn't quite kill, because deep down, everyone knew the truth had already slipped through their fingers. Monroe sat high on the bench, gavel in hand, but he no longer looked like the arrogant man who mocked victims. He looked haunted. His eyes darted across the courtroom, as if shadows were watching him, waiting for their chance. And maybe they were, because what Monroe didn't know, what the Alliance hadn't seen, was that the journalist who disappeared had left behind a backup, a single hard drive, hidden in a place no one thought to look. And that hard drive was now in the hands of a young intern. Someone no one had ever paid attention to. Someone invisible. The kind of underdog that powerful men like Monroe always underestimated. That intern pressed upload. And while Monroe gave his ruling that morning, while the Alliance congratulated themselves on silencing the world, screens across the city lit up with a video. A video of Judge Monroe's drunken rant. His threats, his confessions, his betrayal of the Alliance. The fortress didn't just crack. It shattered. Phones buzzed in the courtroom. Murmurs turned into gasps. Monroe's voice echoed from the very devices of the jurors, the lawyers, even the bailiffs. His own words, proof of everything he had denied. The Alliance's dirty empire was no longer a rumor. It was fact. Monroe froze. His hand shook on the gavel. For the first time, the judge was no longer the one delivering judgment. He was the one being judged. The Alliance moved fast. Too fast. Within hours, their empire began to eat itself alive. Senators turned on businessmen. Officers leaked names to save themselves. Allies became traitors. And Monroe became the scapegoat. That night, he received a call. A cold, static-filled voice on the other end. You should have kept quiet, Monroe. Now you're finished. He slammed the phone down, panic clawing at his chest. For all his arrogance, Monroe finally understood. The robe wouldn't protect him. The gavel couldn't save him. And the Alliance no longer needed him. The next morning, he didn't appear in court. Instead, the city woke to flashing lights, sirens cutting through the dawn. A body had been found. Not Monroe's, but the senator who had leaked the documents. His car torched. His secrets burned. The Alliance had made their move. And Monroe? He was gone. Some said he fled the country. Some whispered he was in hiding, working on his revenge. But others believed something darker, that the Alliance had silenced him too, erasing him from the very system he once controlled. But then a week later, a single envelope arrived at a major news station. No return address. No fingerprints. Just one sentence scrawled in bold black ink. The Alliance isn't finished. And neither am I. The anchor held it up live on air. The city erupted. Was Monroe alive? Was he plotting his comeback? Or was the Alliance using his name to spread fear? No one knew. But one thing was certain, justice wasn't finished. And this story, this war between power and truth, had only just begun. What do you think really happened to Judge Monroe? Did the Alliance silence him? Or is he out there planning something even darker? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your theories. And if you can't get enough of these courtroom twists and power struggles, check out my other stories right here on the channel. Trust me, you don't want to miss the next one.